She was removing her medication from the cart when I stepped forward and paid the $18. What I didn't know was that the man watching me do it would one day walk into a room full of generals and change my life forever. My name is Ashley Parker. When this story happened, I was 29 years old and serving as a captain in the United States Army. If you'd met me back then, nothing about me would have seemed especially remarkable. My father spent 34 years as an electrician in Ohio. My mother taught third grade at a public elementary school. We weren't poor, but we weren't wealthy either. My parents believed in a short list of simple things. Show up on time. Keep your word. Help people when you can. Don't expect applause for doing what's right. Those lessons followed me everywhere. Into adulthood. Into the Army. And onto a rainy Thursday evening in Virginia when everything in my life quietly began to shift. The week had already squeezed every last drop of energy out of me. My unit had just finished a major field training exercise that felt less like preparation and more like punishment. 5 days of minimal sleep, cold military rations, and sheer stubborn will. By Thursday evening, my body felt like it was carrying twice its own weight. All I wanted was a hot meal, a long shower, and silence. The sky hung heavy over the town as I drove toward the grocery store just outside the base. Rain tapped softly against my windshield. Streetlights stretched across wet pavement in long golden streaks. The town itself was the kind of place you barely notice but somehow always remember. A pharmacy, a diner that had probably served the same regulars for 30 years. A grocery store where military families and locals cross paths almost daily. Felt familiar. Safe. The kind of place where people still held doors open for strangers. Inside, the store smelled like fresh bread and coffee. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Shopping carts rattled across polished floors. Somewhere nearby, a child was negotiating for candy with the kind of desperation usually reserved for hostage situations. Normal life. The kind military service teaches you to appreciate more deeply. I grabbed a basket and moved through the aisles. Chicken, rice, coffee, eggs. Nothing exciting. Just enough to carry me through the next few days. About 20 minutes later, I headed toward the checkout lanes. That's when I noticed him. An elderly man stood in line at register 4. At first glance, there was nothing unusual. He appeared to be somewhere in his 80s. Silver hair neatly combed. Posture slightly curved with age. He wore an old brown jacket that looked well-maintained but heavily used. His cart wasn't full, far from it. A handful of items. Milk, bread, canned soup, a prescription medication, a small package of crackers, a frozen dinner. The kind of groceries someone buys when they're living alone. I probably would have moved on without a second thought. Except for what happened next. The cashier scanned the final item. The register beeped. The old man inserted his card. A few seconds passed. Then came the sound, sharp, flat, unmistakable. Transaction declined. The cashier smiled politely. Sometimes these things happen. Would you like to try again? He nodded. Yes, ma'am. His voice was soft and calm. He tried again. Another decline. I watched his shoulders sink. Not dramatically, just slightly. The way a person's body responds when dignity is being quietly tested. The cashier lowered her voice. I'm sorry, sir. For a moment he just stared at the screen. Then he took a slow breath. That's all right. A smile appeared on his face, but it wasn't a real smile. It was the kind worn by someone working hard to hold themselves together. Let's put some things back. Something about those words hit me in a place I didn't expect. Maybe it was the tone. He didn't sound surprised. He sounded practiced. He reached for the frozen dinner first. Let's start with this. The cashier removed it from the total. Then the crackers. Then the soup. The number dropped slowly, item by item. The line behind him stayed quiet. Nobody complained. Nobody rushed him. But the embarrassment was spreading across his face despite everything he was doing to hide it. His hands trembled slightly as he reached toward the next item. The prescription medication. He paused. Longer this time. The cashier noticed. Would you like to keep that one? Yes, he said. If possible. The machine recalculated. Still not enough. The old man stared at the medication for a long moment. Then his jaw tightened. He nodded slowly. All right. Remove it too. That was the moment. Because there are expressions you see once and never fully forget. What was on his face wasn't frustration. It wasn't anger. It was something quieter and heavier than both. It was the look of a man who had spent a lifetime solving problems alone, and had finally arrived at a place where the solutions had run out. Before I could talk myself out of it, I stepped forward. "Excuse me." Both of them turned. I smiled at the cashier. "Just add the rest to my bill." The old man shook his head immediately. No, that's not necessary." "It is to me." His expression changed. Something softened behind his eyes. "You don't need to do that." I glanced at the screen. $18 and some change. Less than I'd spent on lunch earlier that week. "Trust me," I said. "I've got it." The cashier looked relieved. Moments later, the payment went through. Every item stayed in his cart, including the medication. For several seconds, he simply looked at me without speaking. Then he extended his hand. His grip was surprisingly firm. "What is your name, young lady?" "Ashley," I smiled. "Ashley Parker." He repeated it quietly, as if storing it somewhere careful. "Ashley Parker." Then he nodded. "I appreciate what you did." It was nothing. He studied me for a moment with calm, unhurried eyes. Then he said something I would carry with me long after that evening ended. "The world still has good people in it." I laughed softly. "My mother would say you're giving me too much credit." His eyes warmed. "Perhaps." We said goodbye. I gathered my bags and headed for the parking lot. As I loaded groceries into my car, I caught a glimpse of him leaving the store. What caught my attention wasn't him. It was the vehicle waiting nearby. An older black sedan, spotlessly clean. A man in a dark jacket stepped out and opened the passenger door with practiced precision. Something about the interaction felt different. Professional. Deliberate. The old man climbed in. The sedan pulled quietly into the rain and disappeared. For a brief moment, I wondered who he was. Then I let it go. Or at least I thought I did. What I couldn't have known was that inside that sedan, while rain blurred the Virginia roads ahead, the old man was already thinking, already remembering, already making decisions that would soon carry my name to people far above my rank. Over the following days, I didn't think much about the old man from the grocery store. The Army has a way of filling every available space in your mind. Reports, training schedules, meetings, personnel reviews, budget discussions that made me wish for another field exercise. By Monday, the grocery store encounter had been tucked away in the back of my memory, alongside hundreds of other small moments that feel significant and then slowly fade. Except I was wrong about one thing. While I had moved on, someone else hadn't. That rainy evening, the black sedan traveled nearly 40 minutes through winding Virginia roads. The elderly man sat in the rear seat watching rain slide down the window. His driver glanced occasionally at the rearview mirror. Finally, he broke the silence. "Would you like me to look into her, sir?" The old man didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the darkness outside. "What do you think?" The driver considered it. "I think most people would have walked past." The old man nodded slowly. "So do I." A few more miles passed in silence. Then he spoke again. "Find out who she is." The driver didn't ask questions. "Yes, sir." The next morning, quiet phone calls began moving through both military and civilian circles. Not investigations, not formal inquiries, just conversations. The kind that happen when respected people ask careful questions of other respected people. And because of who the old man was, those questions were answered quickly and honestly. Meanwhile, I was standing in formation at 6 in the morning, completely unaware. The sun hadn't fully risen yet. Cool air moved across the parade field. Coffee appeared like survival equipment. Sergeants exchanged updates. Soldiers debated weekend football games. Normal life. And across Virginia, people who had known me at different points in my career were quietly answering questions about who Ashley Parker really was. The old man wasn't interested in my service record. Not at first. Awards, promotions, evaluation reports. Those were easy to find. Paperwork only tells part of a story. What he wanted to know was something different, something harder to measure. Who was I when nobody important was watching? The first person he contacted was a retired colonel who had supervised me during an overseas deployment. The colonel listened to the question. Then he laughed. "You called me about Ashley Parker? Tell me about her." The colonel didn't hesitate. "She's the same person on a Tuesday afternoon that she is when the general visits. Meaning she's genuine? There was a pause. Then the colonel added something unexpected. 3 years ago, one of our younger soldiers lost his father without warning. The kid couldn't afford a last-minute plane ticket home. What happened? Ashley found out and bought the ticket. The old man frowned slightly. From a unit fund? The colonel chuckled. Her own money. The conversation lasted another 20 minutes. When it ended, the old man thanked him and immediately made another call. Then another. Then another. A pattern began emerging, slow and unmistakable. A military spouse stranded after her car broke down while her husband was deployed. Ashley had spent an entire Saturday helping arrange repairs. A young private struggling before his promotion exam. She had stayed after hours to tutor him. An elderly veteran at a community event who had sat mostly alone. Ashley had spent nearly 2 hours with him, listening to stories most people were too busy to hear. None of the stories were dramatic. None of them had been shared publicly. In fact, most of the people involved hadn't even known others were aware of what had happened. The old man found that detail more telling than anything else. Because in his experience, character was never revealed through grand gestures. Character revealed itself through repetition. Small decisions. Quiet habits. Choices made consistently across time when nothing was at stake except integrity. Several days later, he sat in the sunlit study of his modest Virginia home reviewing handwritten notes. The room told the story of a lifetime quietly and without announcement. Bookshelves lined with military history. Framed photographs on polished wooden tables. Remarkably few personal trophies or oversized portraits. Nothing that loudly proclaimed importance. His driver entered carrying a folder. I've gathered everything I could find. The old man accepted it. What did you learn? The driver sat across from him. Honestly, she appears to be exactly who she seemed to be. The old man opened the folder. Pages of information spread before him. Service history. Professional recommendations. Community involvement. Informal observations from people who had worked alongside her for years. He studied each page carefully. Then he noticed a handwritten comment from a senior non-commissioned officer. The note read, Captain Parker never asks soldiers to do something she wouldn't do herself. He read it twice. Then a third time. A faint smile crossed his face. Because genuine leadership wasn't something you could maintain as a performance. Not for long. Eventually people saw through the act. The best leaders earn trust the slow way, day by day, decision by decision. The note felt like truth. The old man leaned back in his chair. His gaze drifted toward a framed photograph on a nearby shelf. A much younger version of himself looked back. Sharp features, military uniform, confident eyes. The photograph had been taken decades earlier, before retirement, before age had softened everything, before the weight of years had left its quiet marks. He stared at it for a long moment. Then his thoughts traveled further back to a memory very few people knew about. A cold winter morning. A bus station. An empty wallet. A young military officer struggling and embarrassed and out of options. And then a stranger, quiet, unhurried, expecting nothing, who had stepped forward and helped. The details of that morning remained vivid despite everything the years had covered. The stranger's face had blurred. His name was gone entirely. But the kindness remained. Perfectly preserved. One small act. One simple gesture. And yet it had echoed inside him for a lifetime. Perhaps that was why the grocery store had reached him so deeply. It wasn't about $18. It was about recognizing something rare. The willingness to help quietly, without expecting anything in return, without an audience to validate the choice. The old man closed the folder. She doesn't know any of this is happening, does she? The driver shook his head. No, sir. Good. What would you like to do next? The elderly man rose slowly and walked to the window. Late afternoon sunlight moved through the trees outside. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke. I think I'd like to meet Captain Parker again. The driver smiled. I suspected you might. The old man nodded. But this time under different circumstances. The driver waited. What kind of circumstances? A small smile appeared. The kind that suggested a plan had already taken shape. Let's just say I'd like to see her reaction. Several days later, a single phone call was placed. The conversation was brief, professional, and precise. The person on the other end listened carefully and responded without hesitation. Yes, sir. Far across the base inside my office, I was working through routine paperwork, completely unaware that my name had just entered a conversation involving people far beyond my chain of command. The second Thursday after the grocery store began like any other day. Nothing unusual about the weather. Nothing unusual about the schedule. If anything, I was looking forward to a relatively quiet afternoon, which in military life almost always means something unexpected is about to arrive. I reached headquarters just after 7 in the morning, travel mug in hand, running through a growing list of things that needed my attention before the day ended. Emails, personnel reviews, training reports, a budget meeting I had been quietly dreading all week. Outside my office window, the Virginia sky was clear and bright. Sunlight reflected off vehicles moving through the base. Somewhere nearby, soldiers were finishing physical training. Everything felt predictable, calm, safe. By noon I was halfway through a stack of paperwork when a knock interrupted my focus. Come in. The door opened. Staff Sergeant Miller stepped inside. I'd worked with Miller for nearly 2 years. He was dependable, steady under pressure, and almost impossible to unsettle, which was exactly why I immediately noticed his expression. Not alarm. Not excitement. Something that lived uncomfortably between the two. Ma'am. I looked up from my desk. What's up? The colonel wants to see you. I frowned. Now. Yes, ma'am. That wasn't necessarily alarming. Commanders called officers in all the time. But something in his voice made me pause. Did he say what it's about? No, ma'am. That didn't help. I set down my pen. All right. Miller hesitated just briefly. Then he added quietly. He asked that you come immediately. The moment he left, a small tight knot formed in my stomach. In the Army, an unexpected summons from a senior commander usually means one of 3 things. You've done something very right. You've done something very wrong. Or you're about to inherit someone else's problem. The troubling part was that all 3 possibilities tend to sound identical right up until the moment they aren't. As I walked down the hallway toward the command section, my mind started conducting its own rapid investigation. Had I missed a deadline? No. Was there an issue with my unit? Not that I knew of. Had someone filed a complaint? I couldn't imagine why. But uncertainty feeds itself quickly, and by the time I reached the colonel's outer office, I had mentally reviewed nearly every decision I'd made over the previous month. The command secretary looked up. Captain Parker, the colonel is expecting you. I nodded. Then something in the atmosphere caught my attention. People weren't behaving strangely exactly, but they weren't behaving normally either. Conversations seemed quieter than usual. Several officers glanced toward me and then looked quickly away. One major offered me an awkward smile that answered nothing and raised every remaining question. I approached the office door. Took a breath. Knocked twice. Enter. I opened the door and stopped. This was not what I expected. Not even close. The colonel was there, but he was not alone. Several senior officers occupied the room. A brigadier general stood near one wall. 2 colonels sat near the conference table. A command sergeant major remained positioned near the window. The gathering looked less like a routine meeting and more like something deliberate and significant was about to unfold. My pulse quickened. Then I noticed the final person in the room. An elderly man sat quietly in a chair facing away from the door. I could see only the back of his head. Silver hair. Gray suit. Nothing unusual. And yet something about the shape of him, the stillness of him, felt strangely familiar. The colonel smiled. Captain Parker, please come in. I stepped forward. The door closed behind me. The elderly man slowly turned around. For a moment my brain refused to cooperate. Recognition arrived like a delayed impact. Then it hit all at once. It was him. The old man from the grocery store. The same silver hair. The same calm, unhurried eyes. The same quiet expression that seemed to understand more than it revealed. For several seconds I simply stood there, not because I lacked words, because none of the words I had made sense of this situation. Every question in my mind went silent and was replaced by a single larger one. Why is he here? The old man smiled. The warm, knowing smile of someone who remembers. Captain Parker. Sir. That was all I managed. The colonel gestured toward an empty chair. Please have a seat. I sat down carefully, trying to remain composed, trying not to stare, failing at both. The old man watched me with what I can only describe as gentle amusement, as though he understood precisely what was happening inside my head, which wasn't difficult. The grocery store, the declined card, the medication, the $18. How had any of that led to this room? Then something happened that reordered everything. The elderly man shifted slightly in his chair. Immediately, every senior officer in the room gave him their complete, focused attention. Not the casual attention of equals. The respectful, deferential attention reserved for people whose judgment carries genuine weight. A chill moved slowly down my spine. Who is this man? The colonel folded his hands and spoke with deliberate care. Captain Parker, there is someone we would like to formally introduce you to. I looked toward him, then back toward the old man. The room had gone so quiet I could hear the air conditioning. The colonel continued. 2 weeks ago, you encountered this gentleman at a grocery store. I nodded slowly. Yes, sir. And you assisted him? Yes, sir. The old man spoke. His voice was exactly as I remembered it. Soft, measured, unhurried. You didn't know who I was? No, sir. A faint smile appeared. No, you certainly didn't. Quiet laughter moved through the room. I didn't laugh. Mostly because I still had absolutely no idea what was happening. The colonel glanced toward the elderly man, then back toward me. His expression became formal, deliberate. Captain Parker, I would like you to meet General Robert Whitmore. For one brief second I thought I had misheard. Then reality arrived. General Robert Whitmore. The name landed like something physical. Every officer in the Army knew that name. Every single one. Even in retirement, Robert Whitmore was a living legend. 4-star general. Former theater commander. Decorated combat leader. One of the most respected military figures of his generation. I had studied his campaigns in professional military education courses. Read analyses of his leadership decisions. Seen his photographs in military publications. But those photographs showed a younger man. A uniformed man. A commanding, powerful man. Not an elderly gentleman carefully removing crackers from a grocery cart, because his card had been declined. My heart began pounding, not from fear, from complete disbelief, because suddenly every detail from that checkout lane was replaying with brutal clarity. The trembling hands, the apologetic smile, the medication he had almost surrendered, the $18 and some change. None of it made sense anymore. And yet there he sat, less than 10 feet away, watching my reaction with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. General Whitmore smiled. The same smile from the grocery store. Hello again, Captain Parker. For a moment nobody spoke. The room seemed suspended between two completely different realities. A grocery store checkout lane and a command office filled with senior military leaders. Then the general leaned forward slightly, and when he spoke, his voice carried a warmth that felt entirely genuine. I owe you an explanation. The room remained completely still. Not the tense silence before bad news. Not the awkward silence that follows confusion. This was something else. The rare silence that settles over a room when everyone present understands they are witnessing something that will be remembered. General Robert Whitmore sat comfortably in his chair, watching me with the same unhurried calm he'd carried at the grocery store. Only now I understood why the room shifted when he moved. Even in retirement, this man possessed something that no rank insignia could create or remove. Presence. The kind built through decades of decisions, sacrifice, and earned responsibility. I sat perfectly still trying to process the fact that one of the most decorated generals in modern Army history had somehow appeared in my commander's office because of an $18 grocery bill. The situation felt almost surreal. Whitmore seemed to sense exactly what I was thinking. I can see you're still trying to make sense of all this. Soft laughter moved through the room. I managed a weak smile. Yes, sir. The general nodded. That's fair. He leaned back and folded his hands. Captain Parker, before we go any further, I want you to understand something. His voice remained gentle, precise, the voice of a man who no longer needed to perform for anyone. I did not come here because you paid for my groceries. The statement immediately sharpened every person's attention in the room. Whitmore looked around slowly. I know that's what everyone assumes. He paused. But they would be wrong. Officers exchanged quiet glances. The general continued. Plenty of people are capable of performing a single kind act. He looked directly at me. A single act of kindness is admirable. Then his expression deepened. But character is something entirely different. He wasn't talking about groceries anymore. Everyone in the room understood that. He turned slightly toward the gathered officers. After I met Captain Parker, I became curious. I noticed a few knowing smiles. They already knew where this was headed. I wanted to know whether what I witnessed that evening represented who she truly was. He paused. Or whether I had simply caught someone on a particularly good day. Quiet laughter. Then his eyes returned to me. So I asked questions. Quite a few questions. And suddenly I understood everything. The phone calls. The quiet conversations. The mysterious interest in a captain nobody above my immediate chain of command should have had any reason to notice. The general nodded as though confirming my realization. And what I discovered impressed me far more than anything that happened at that grocery store. I didn't know where to look. Compliments have always made me uncomfortable, especially in rooms full of people I deeply respect. Fortunately, Whitmore wasn't interested in embarrassing me. Instead, he began to speak. He told stories. Stories I hadn't thought about in years. Stories I hadn't realized anyone else knew. The young soldier whose father had died suddenly during deployment. The emergency plane ticket. I remembered that situation clearly. At the time, helping had felt like the only logical response. The private needed to get home. I had the means to make it happen. That was all. Apparently it was more than that. Whitmore recounted it in full. Then the military spouse stranded with a broken-down vehicle, while her husband was overseas. Then the junior soldier grinding through promotion prep. Then another. And another. Hearing these moments spoken aloud in a room like this was a genuinely strange experience. Not because the events seemed remarkable, because I had never once thought of them that way. They were simply moments. Small decisions. Ordinary opportunities that happened to be in front of me. But as Whitmore connected them one by one, I began hearing them from the outside for the first time. And I noticed something I had never consciously recognized before. There was a pattern. Not deliberate. Not planned. Just a way of moving through the world. A habit. The general eventually stopped. The room held the silence for a moment. Then he said something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Captain Parker, every person I contacted told me a different story. He paused. But every story described the same woman. I swallowed hard. That gets my attention. The sincerity behind those words reached somewhere no formal commendation ever had. Then Whitmore turned toward the window overlooking the parade grounds. For several moments he seemed to be looking at something far beyond the base. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted. Quieter, more reflective, almost private. Most people assume leadership begins with authority. He shook his head slowly. I've spent my entire life learning that isn't true. The room held its breath. I've known brilliant officers who could not inspire trust. He glanced around. And I've known young leaders with almost no formal authority who could inspire extraordinary loyalty. He looked directly at me. The difference is character. The word landed simply, quietly, and it was heavier than anything else said in that room. Then, unexpectedly, General Whitmore began sharing a story from his own life. One I had never heard. One that very few people apparently knew. Many years before the stars, before the commands, before his name became synonymous with military excellence, he had been a struggling young officer. Recently married. Financially stretched. Trying to build something out of very little. One winter morning he found himself stranded. Wallet nearly empty, options exhausted, pride quietly crumbling. And then a stranger stepped forward. Not a friend. Not a colleague. A stranger who saw a problem and simply helped solve it. Asked for nothing. Expected nothing. And disappeared from his life almost immediately. Whitmore never forgot. People remember kindness, he said softly. Especially when they need it most. The room fell into the deepest silence yet. Because everyone in it understood the truth resting inside those words. Some memories blur with time. Others calcify. They become permanent. They become part of who you are. I never found that man again. The admission seemed to genuinely surprise several people in the room. But I never forgot what he taught me. Whitmore's eyes lifted. And every once in a while, life gives us the chance to continue someone else's example. Something caught in my throat. Not because the moment was dramatic, because I suddenly understood, clearly and completely, why that grocery store had mattered to him. It wasn't about money. It was about recognition. One act of kindness seeing itself reflected in another. Across decades, across generations, across lives that had no earthly reason to ever intersect. The general rose slowly from his chair. Immediately, every person in the room stood with him. Not because protocol demanded it, because respect did. Whitmore reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Then he walked toward me. I stood without thinking. The room seemed to disappear around the two of us. He opened the box. Inside rested a challenge coin. Not a standard one. A rare coin bearing the insignia of commands he had led throughout a remarkable career. The metal caught the office light and held it. I've carried this tradition for many years. His voice was steady and deliberate. I only present these coins when I encounter something worth remembering. He placed it in my hands. I accepted it with both. The coin felt heavier than it had any right to be, as though it carried history, responsibility, and meaning beyond its size. Then the general produced a sealed envelope. My personal letter of recommendation. I stared at it. I had no words. None at all. Whitmore smiled. I suspect you'll find good use for it someday. Soft laughter filled the room. I couldn't participate. My emotions had finally caught up with everything happening around me. The general placed his hand on my shoulder. Then he spoke the words I have returned to more times than I can count. The Army needs more leaders like Captain Ashley Parker. For a moment nobody moved. Then applause filled the room. Not loud. Not performative. Genuine, measured, heartfelt. I looked around and saw senior officers smiling, NCOs nodding, people whose respect I had worked years to earn. And somehow, none of it felt like recognition for a single moment at a grocery store checkout lane. It felt like recognition for every quiet choice that nobody had watched. Every decision made without an audience. Every moment of ordinary decency that had never been acknowledged, and was never meant to be. As the applause settled, General Whitmore stepped back. The warmth in his expression remained. And though I didn't fully understand it yet, the greatest thing he was giving me that afternoon wasn't the coin, and it wasn't the letter, and it wasn't the praise. It was a lesson. One he had spent a lifetime learning. And one that was about to reshape everything that came after. When people hear this story, they usually ask the same question. Did that meeting change my career? The honest answer is yes. But not in the way most people imagine. General Whitmore's letter carried enormous weight, and it opened doors that likely would have remained closed otherwise. The challenge coin became one of my most treasured possessions. Opportunities arrived in the months that followed that I would not have found on my own. All of that is true. But none of it is the part that stayed with me. The weeks following our meeting felt different in a way I struggled to name at first. My responsibilities hadn't changed. I still arrived early, still attended every meeting, still chased deadlines and solved problems and pushed through ordinary days. The Army kept moving forward, indifferent to personal revelations. And yet something inside me had shifted. I found myself returning to General Whitmore's story, specifically the story about the stranger who had helped him decades earlier. A man whose name was never learned. A man who never knew where his kindness had traveled. A man who had unknowingly touched the life of someone who would go on to command thousands of soldiers and shape the careers of countless officers. The idea stayed with me in a way I hadn't expected. Most of us want to see results. We want confirmation that our choices mattered, that our sacrifices landed somewhere, that the things we gave up produced something worth giving them up for. But life rarely works that way. Sometimes the most consequential things we do disappear silently into the future, far beyond where we can follow them. General Whitmore had learned to be at peace with that. Slowly I began learning it too. About 3 months after our meeting, I received notification that I had been selected for a highly competitive leadership development program. The selection process had been rigorous. Dozens of exceptional officers had applied. When I saw my name, I felt proud, grateful, and genuinely humbled all at once. A week later, I learned that General Whitmore had personally agreed to serve as one of the program's senior mentors. I remember laughing out loud when I read that. The odds felt impossible. And yet there it was. Over the following year we spoke several times. Never frequently, never formally, but consistently enough that I began to understand the remarkable person behind the legendary name. What surprised me most was his humility. This was a man who had operated at the highest levels of military leadership for decades. A man whose decisions had shaped enormous organizations and altered the trajectories of countless lives. And yet he never spoke as though he had finished learning. He asked questions. He listened. He stayed curious. During one conversation, I finally asked something that had been quietly bothering me since the day we met. "Sir, were you really struggling to pay for those groceries?" The general laughed. A full, genuine laugh, the kind that reaches the eyes. No. I couldn't help smiling. I suspected that. He nodded. The card was intentionally deactivated. I stared at him for a moment. Then I laughed too because the alternative was being mildly offended. And he was a 4-star general. That's a fairly elaborate setup. He chuckled. Perhaps. Then his expression settled into something more thoughtful. But it wasn't intended as a test. He shook his head. I wanted time around ordinary people without anyone recognizing me. People behave differently around someone with authority or status. I understand that better than most. The situation simply unfolded. He paused. And then you appeared. I smiled. And spent $18. He pointed at me. Best investment I ever made. We both laughed. But beneath the lightness, the real truth was unmistakable. That grocery store encounter had connected two lives that had no logical reason to ever intersect. Not through status or rank or formal introduction. Through something far simpler, far older, and far more durable. Months became a year. The program ended. Responsibilities increased. Life kept its forward momentum. But General Whitmore's lessons remained, especially one. Character is what you do when nobody is watching. The phrase is simple enough to dismiss. But the longer I served and the more I understood about people, the more accurate it became. We talk about defining moments, major decisions, historic events, the turning points that reshape everything. But character isn't forged in those moments. Character is built on ordinary Tuesdays, ordinary Thursdays, ordinary evenings in grocery stores when nobody who matters is watching. And there's no reason to do anything except walk past. It is built through small choices that accumulate quietly into habits. Habits that gradually become identity. And identity in the end is everything. Nearly 2 years after our first meeting, I found myself returning to the same grocery store. The weather felt familiar in a way that almost made me stop. Cool air. Gray sky. A hint of rain pressing down from the clouds. I smiled at the coincidence. Inside, the store was exactly as I remembered. Same bright lights. Same checkout lanes. Same smell of coffee and bread drifting from the back. For a moment, the memories returned easily. The old man. The declined card. The grocery cart. The beginning of something I never could have anticipated. I finished shopping and moved toward the registers. That's when I saw her. An elderly woman standing at the checkout counter. Her cart held only a few items. Bread, milk, eggs, a prescription medication. The cashier was speaking quietly. The woman looked down at her purse. Then back at the register. And then I recognized the expression because I had seen it before. The same quiet struggle. The same careful dignity. The same effort to hold herself together while everything in her was pulling in the opposite direction. Slowly, she began removing items from the cart one by one. The moment felt almost impossible. Like life had deliberately carried me back to the exact same crossroads and was waiting, unhurried and patient, to see what I would do. For one moment I simply watched. Then I smiled. Not because I expected anything remarkable to follow. Not because I imagined some extraordinary consequence arriving from what I was about to do. Not because I was hoping a decorated general might materialize from behind a display of cereal boxes. I smiled because I already knew exactly what I was going to do. And it required no deliberation at all. I stepped forward. The words came as naturally as breathing. Just add it to my bill. The elderly woman turned. Surprised. Confused. Then quietly, deeply grateful. The exact expression General Whitmore had worn 2 years earlier in a different grocery store on a different rainy evening. She tried to refuse. I gently shook my head. It's all right. A few minutes later, Every item remained in her cart, including the medication. She thanked me several times, her voice catching slightly. Then she left. That was it. No audience. No applause. No reward. Just a small and quiet act of ordinary decency, exactly the kind General Whitmore had spent a lifetime recognizing and defending and trying to pass forward. As I walked back to my car, light rain began falling from the clouds. I paused beside my door and looked back toward the store entrance. People moved in and out, carrying bags, living ordinary lives, carrying invisible struggles, fighting private battles they never mentioned to anyone, simply doing their best with what they had. And standing there in the quiet rain, I finally understood something that had taken years to fully take shape inside me. Most greatness is not dramatic. Most greatness is not famous. Most greatness happens quietly in small moments between ordinary people, one choice at a time. The stranger who helped a young officer on a cold winter morning decades ago probably never imagined his kindness would travel this far. General Whitmore never forgot him. I never forgot General Whitmore. And somewhere ahead, in a future neither of us can see, perhaps someone else won't forget either. Because kindness travels further than we expect, further than we can measure, further than we will ever fully understand.